and safety warnings as they moved into more manufacturing jobs. And back then, we said we're going to make a high school education both free and mandatory. Now we recognize people need more education. So my view is let's make that post-high school public education available to everyone. It's an investment in our future. And we should do it with technical schools, with 2-year, with 4-year college. We should also level the playing field. And for me, that's $50 billion into our historically black colleges and universities. And just one more, and that is cancel student loan debt for 43 million Americans who are dealing with it right now. So here's how I see this. 2 cents from the top 0.1% who have made it so big in this country, in part because of the investments everybody else made, and in part because of what they did themselves. Just asking them, come on, pitch in a little more so that we can invest in an entire generation of young people. That's how we build a future in this country, and we do it for everyone.
Some critics of the 2-cent tax have cited countries in Europe that had a wealth tax at one point and moved away from it, and France in particular, where 42,000, I think is the figure often cited, people moved out of France because of that tax. Yeah. How do you avoid those problems?
Well, partly you learn from other people who tried it and what didn't work. So the principal problems in Europe when they did it were twofold. One is that they went way too deep in the wealth range. So it wasn't about a thin layer at the top. It was about a huge portion of the population trying to collect a wealth tax from everyone. And look, you can get into an argument over whether or not a 4-year-old Prius is worth $15,000 or $18,000, but it's not exactly where you're going to bring in a lot of revenue and where you're going to make a lot of difference, and in my view, not where we should be putting our taxes. That's not where I want to tax. We have a middle class that's already under way too much financial constraint. But the second part is they created way too many exceptions to the rule. Instead of just saying whatever property you got, wherever it's held, it was whether it was held in country or out of country. It was whether it was held in this form or that form. And guess what? Billionaires are slippery. They know how to move out of the country. They know how to move their assets out of the country. They know how to switch from holding assets in cash to holding assets in gold bars or in paintings. So I spent a lot of time with a lot of tax experts, including the lawyers who help these guys protect their fortunes from tax. And they said the easiest way to do this is keep it simple. And what I propose for a wealth tax is whatever property you got, wherever you're holding it. And here's the interesting thing. It turns out a huge hunk of the wealth is really easy to find because it's in real estate and it's in stock portfolios. And stock portfolios, we already know where that's held. Another reason it's relatively easier to find is these giant fortunes have their own money managers. They have their own internal bookkeeping because they're all getting 1% off these big fortunes for managing the money. So they're already keeping records on this. And another part is the tax world has changed. So the United States has been signing tax treaties for a decade now that basically say to other countries around the world, you tell us what American citizens are holding in your country, and we'll tell you what your citizens are holding in our country. You know, countries that are working hard to provide for their own people are tired of the really wealthy escaping any part of that tax burden. And so the whole kind of world is shifting around that and shifting away from the tax havens. So the other thing we did when we put this together is we assumed in doing the numbers and where you can spend a 15% tax cheat rate, which I hope is way too high, but it means the numbers have already built that in. Plus, we really plussed up on the enforcement. So there's going to be a lot of IRS enforcement on it, IRS agents who are skilled at this. You know, it's something the IRS already does for estates. You've got to value what the paintings were worth and so on. So we've got a lot more enforcement in it. And first couple of years, you're going to have to climb that hill to get it right. But after that, once you've got the Rembrandt, you're going to have to explain if you're claiming you don't have it now or that it dropped in value by 50%. So a lot of this on wealth, once you kind of get over the initial part, is going to be, I think, a lot easier to track.
Assuming that you could keep it simple
Yeah.
from the get-go, as you say yourself, wealthy people are very crafty, and they're going to go to Congress. And how long is it before they've made it very complicated and gotten rid of the simplicity and it doesn't work anymore?
So you're asking me who has more influence in Washington? Who has more influence in a democracy? The 12 million children who'll be helped by universal child care, the 43 million Americans who'll see their student loan canceled, or the handful out of the 70,000 families that have these great fortunes. You know, you're asking the fundamental question, who Washington works for. And that's basically why I'm in this race. I'm sick of a Washington that works for the billionaires and doesn't work very well for anyone else. I'm sick of a Washington where the folks with money get to come in and call all the shots. I get it. They may own more shoes than the rest of us do. They may own more cars than the rest of us do. They may own more houses than everyone else does. But they shouldn't own a bigger share of democracy. And to me, that's...
How does that change?
Well, that's why I start with an anti-corruption bill. That's my first priority, is that the influence of money in Washington has just fundamentally changed who this government works for. Concrete example of that is the minimum wage. I grew up in a family that held on to its place in the middle class pretty much by our fingernails. But when my daddy had a heart attack and couldn't work, and my mother was 50 years old, had never worked outside the home, and to save our house and to save our family, ended up putting on her best dress and her high heels and walked to the Sears and got a full-time minimum wage job answering phones. That was at a time in America when a full-time minimum wage job would support a family of 3. It would pay a mortgage, it would cover the utilities, and it would put food on the table. Today, a full-time minimum wage job in America will not keep a mama and a baby out of poverty. That's wrong, and it's why I'm in this fight. But understand that difference is not a difference of gravity. It's not a difference just because over time things change. It's a difference about who government works for. You go back and look. When I was a girl, the question asked about the minimum wage is, what does it take a family of 3 to make it in America? What does it take as a minimum wage to build a solid foundation, to give people a toehold in America's middle class? Today, the question asked in Washington is basically, where should the minimum wage be to maximize profits for giant multinational corporations? That's the difference in who government works for. And that's what the 2020 election is all about. Are we going to have a country that just keeps working better and better and better? That GDP keeps going up, but the share that's going to the 90% just shrinks to nothing. Are we going to have a government that only works for those at the top? Or are we going to have a government that works for everyone?
In answering the tax question,
Sure.
you mentioned there would be a lot more enforcement. So essentially, you're talking about expanding the IRS.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? And more generally, sort of, what's the size of the federal workforce if there is a Warren administration?
So there are places where we need to expand the federal workforce, and tax enforcement is part of it. We have a real problem in this country with people cheating on their taxes. Not middle-class families, folks up at the top, who've not just gotten loopholes in Washington, but that's not enough. It's still cheating. It's mischaracterizing. It's cheating on their taxes. And the estimates on what that costs us as a country is truly staggering. Understand that right now, the billionaires not only love our tax scheme because the 99% pay 7.2% of their wealth, they pay 3.2% of their wealth to keep this country going. They not only love it for that reason, they love those loopholes, they also love the lack of enforcement. They love the fact that the odds you're going to get caught are really small if you cheat. And that if you do get caught, most of the time it's a kind of no harm, no foul, pay up, right? Rather than someone's actually going to keep track and really come after you for this. So I believe we ought to not only ask those folks to pay a little more, we ought to be really serious about collecting that money. And I don't think that's a harsh penalty. I think it's just what's fair. You know, people who make their money by salary, it's all laid out there. It's not like you have a lot of opportunities to cheat on your taxes. It's there. Somebody files your W-2 every year, it's there. In fact, it's one of the reasons we actually ought to be using automatic tax payment, right? To reduce the number of hours you have to spend on it. You ought to be able to just go through and click off and say, yeah, the numbers are right. I verify that they're right and I'm done. The opportunities are for those at the top again. And it's one more example of a system that just keeps working better and better for those folks and worse for everyone else. And that's not just a question of fairness. It's a question of whether we have the resources to invest in our future. How long have people talked about the importance of childcare for all of our kids? I'll tell you at least how long. It's been since I was a young mom and had two little ones. I had my first full-time teaching job in a university, and I had two little ones. And it was hard. I was putting dinner on the table at 8 o'clock. I was doing laundry at 10 o'clock. I was doing my class preps starting at midnight. I could do hard. The part that nearly sank me was childcare. It was the daycare center that smelled bad and my baby cried all the time. It was the babysitter who didn't show up. It was the down the street neighbor who was going to take care of her kids and my kids together and then decides one morning, you know, this just isn't working out. And I had a job. I had to get to class. I was in the spring of my first year of teaching, and my Aunt Bee, who was 78 years old, who's a widow, who lived in Oklahoma, gave me a call. I was her beloved niece. She had carried me home from the hospital, and she said, "How you doing, sweetie?" And I said, "Fine." And then I started to cry. And I said, "I'm going to quit." I loved that job, and I was going to quit because I couldn't do the child care anymore. I just couldn't hold the pieces together. I was failing my children. I felt like I was failing at my job. I was failing all of it. And Aunt Bee listened to me cry and waited for me to blow my nose and get a drink of water. And finally she said, "Well, I can't get there tomorrow, but I'll come on Thursday." And she arrived with 7 suitcases and a Pekingese named Buddy and stayed for 16 years. Without my Aunt Bee, I would have been knocked off the track. And I think about how many women in my generation got knocked off the track and just never got back on, or got back on so many years later. It was just a very different world. How many women of my daughter's generation got knocked off the track? How many mamas and how many daddies today get knocked off the track? Because childcare today is every bit as hard to find as it was for me. Childcare today is outrageously expensive if you can find it. And yet, as a country, while nations around the world have invested in childcare, have invested and said, in the same way we invest in public education, we invest in our babies, partly because it's good opportunities for those babies to be in these stimulating environments, and partly it's good opportunity for their mamas and for their daddies. Nations around the world have done it, and we haven't. So here we are, decades after I struggled for childcare. And what do we do in Congress? A nibble, a little piece. Let's see if we can maybe help a few families at a margin at the bottom edge of where working moms. No. Why do we not provide universal child care? Because nobody has the money for it. Every time you raise this in Washington, the answer is there's no money. Where are you going to pay for it?
Here's a little bit, do we have the workforce for it? I mean, even if you could pay for this, are there enough workers, not just for childcare, but also for elderly care? Yeah, I mean, what do you think about?
Well, I see it the other way
do we have enough
around.
workers?
If we pay for it, we will have the workers. And in fact, that's why it is built into my plan. It's universal child care, universal pre-K, and raising the wages of every child care worker and preschool teacher in this country. I built it right into the dollars needed for this. You have the people if you're willing to pay for them. But no, if it's all going to be built on exploiting people, if it's all going to be built on wages that nobody can actually live on, yeah, it's going to continue to be a terrible squeeze. You know, one of the things I love best, when I talk about this issue in town halls, and I talk about how we could spend 2 cents from the top 0.1% in America, I talk about child care, big applause. I talk about universal pre-K, big applause. I talk about raising the wages of child care workers, and the applause magnifies, principally led by mothers who get this, that the system we've got right now of trying to climb over each other to try to find a way to take care of your family and still to be able to make it in the workforce just isn't working for anybody. It's wrong. And offering a way out of that means a lot to mamas, to daddies, to grandmas and grandpas, to child care workers.
I think we get what you're saying, but do you not think we have a worker shortage in
Well,
this country?
we're going to have a worker shortage as long as we don't pay people. You pay people. There are a lot of people who'd like to do this work. It's the same thing with public school. There are a lot of people who'd like to be a public school teacher. But I meet people who say to me, I taught public school for 3 years, but I had to keep a second and a third job. The second one to pay my student loan debt, right? And the third to pay my child care. And I just can't, it just doesn't work. I can't do that on a teacher's salary. How many people said, I meet people who say, I'm really happy now, I am a public school teacher. But the only way I could do that is I had to work 20 years somewhere else and develop a retirement. And now that I've got that retirement, so I'm pulling in 2 paychecks, I can afford to be a public school teacher. You know, the way I see it, budgets, where we spend our money, where you spend it as a family, where you spend it as a country, it's not just about numbers, it's about values. And we need to value our children more. We need to value the education of our children more. And one way we do that is we pay the people who are doing the work. We make sure they've got the resources. We make sure they've got decent buildings to be in and not places where ceiling tiles are falling down and the roof leaks or the bathrooms smell bad. You walk into any bank in America, the bathrooms are nice. You walk into any public school in America, some places the bathrooms are really nice, some places they're not. How can we be in America that says it's okay to have public schools where teachers are starved for resources, where teachers have to reach in their own pockets to buy crayons and paper, that it's okay to have public schools where the message just radiates out? Not that important?
So a bigger picture question on the economy. The president says it's doing great because he cites low unemployment, stock market. How do you measure?
And GDP.
a
Let's
good
do all
economy?
three. How America's working families are doing. And that's not looking so good. So think of it this way. GDP in America has basically gone up since the mid-1930s, right? Dipped in the crash of 2008, but recovered, right? And it's a pretty steady, right? Our country's getting richer. So what does that mean for working families, and what does it mean for the folks at the top? Well, you can kind of look at this roughly in terms of two periods in America, 1935 to about 1980. And what you'll see is GDP goes up, and the 90% of America, everybody outside the top 10%, gets about 70% of all the new income growth in America, right? All the, how wages are going, how there's more growth in income. And okay, it's not as much as 90%, right? But they're getting 70% of the new income growth. 1980 to 2016, 2017, GDP keeps going up. How much does the 90% get of that new income growth in America? And the answer is zero. It's actually 0.4%, so it rounds
So what changed?
to
Why did that
zero.
happen? And how do we reverse it? It can't be just taxation.
It's not just taxation. It's about increasingly who government keeps working for. No, it's not about taxation, but
So what is it? I mean,
look-
what's the answer? 1980 to today, what?
look at the crash of 2008. It's actually a microcosm. So you start in 1980, and at that point we've got pretty careful restrictions on the banks. They'd been bumping up against them for years, but the truth was we kept them. Nobody got huge. Nobody could exercise that much influence in Washington, right? And we had pretty well enforced usury laws, and right? And it kind of rocks along. Mortgages, you got a mortgage that it was pretty clear you could pay off. And then what happens? Banks keep banging at this. You get a couple of Supreme Court decisions. I don't want to get too much in the weeds about how this happens. But the door opens.
We like the weeds, actually.
Oh, good. I'm happy to do it then. 2 Supreme Court decisions in a row, basically, or a Supreme Court decision and a change in law in Congress, open the door to what's called exporting your interest rates. So you could be a bank in California lend to a family in Iowa, and the question is, whose usury rates apply? California usury rates or Iowa usury rates? Well, kind of everybody had assumed if it's Iowa citizens, it's Iowa usury rates, right? That's what lets Iowa protect its own citizens. Supreme Court, in this, at the time, fairly obscure decision, said, no, it's California usury rates because that's where the bank is located. So, click, click. South Dakota says, bring your bank to South Dakota, and we'd be happy to have usury rates that are through the roof. And you can make that the interest rate on your credit cards, and export it to all those places like Iowa that are trying to protect their own citizens. And that's exactly what happened. So that's how people ended up getting credit cards that carried what were at the time shocking interest rates of 19%, 25%, 29.9%, numbers that were just eye-popping and that changed the fundamental lending decision. Because now you didn't just make money lending to people who were likely to be able to pay it back. You made money lending to people who were skirting at the margins, who paid some months and were at minimum payment other months, and maybe even skipped a month so you could hit them with a $50 late fee, that you made so much money off the bounce and the ebb and the flow of marginal families that the whole lending calculation switched, and debt goes through the roof. And families that hit up against a bump find themselves tangled in a web that many of them never are able to get out of. So the credit card companies start making money by the double handfuls. And the mortgage lenders look over and say, dang, we want a piece of that action. So mortgages on homes, on farms, that had basically been pretty straightforward affairs, right? We check your credit history, kind of hard to get, but solid. Everybody went through real low foreclosure rates. Mortgages start getting fancier and trickier. And that's when you start to see, by the late 90s, early 2000s, teaser rate mortgages. Again, it's hard now because we've seen it all, but how shocking it was at the time. So that by the early 2000s, it was possible. They were selling mortgages that had a 1 in 5 chance of costing a family their home because they were qualified on a payment that would only last for 24 months. And in the 25th month, the payment went through the roof, and either your rich uncle dies and leaves you a lot of money, or you're going to lose his house, right? Or you're going to refinance it for another 24 months, putting more debt on the house, right? Paying more fees right now, and put off the eventuality. So that's what the banks start doing. And then, of course, as you know, they start trading in this debt. And the federal government, instead of being on the side of the families, instead of being on the side of American homeowners and people trying to buy homes, they're deep in the pocket of the banks. And so I was going to Washington at this time. I'm not politics, but I'm going to Washington ringing every alarm bell I can. I'm talking to the regulators. I'm talking to folks in Congress. I'm saying, this is all going to come crashing. Look at these numbers. Families are loading up on debt. This is never going to work. They're going to bring down the housing market. They're inflating it, and they're going to crash it. Families are getting tangled up in too much credit card debt. All of this, it's going to end badly for everyone. And nobody wanted to hear it. And of course, that was the crash of 2008. So you ask me what went wrong? Just magnify that in every sector of our economy.
How to fix it. So what do you do now? I mean, what now? How do you? And I know.
Well, let me
the
tell you how I
Consumer
fixed.
Financial Protection Bureau and all the things. I was thinking back. I read a book of yours many years ago, The Two-Income Trap, which is probably right about the time you're talking about.
That's
now.
right.
So what do you do now to fix it?
Well, part of it is the model out of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So think of it this way. We had a choice to make following the crash of 2008. The door opens this wide for reform because a lot of folks have been hurt and there's a lot of pressure for reform. So reform could go one of two ways. We could have, as a country, said, give me your good ideas on how to make sure nobody gets cheated on a mortgage, give me your good ideas on how to make sure nobody gets cheated on a credit card, a payday loan, a student loan, right? And the truth is, at that moment, there were a lot of advocates and advocacy groups that had focused on one or two of those pieces. We should ban yield spread premiums on mortgages. We should ban teaser rates on mortgages. We should ban, right? Certain kinds of disclosures, double cycle billing on credit cards. That would have been one way to approach this. One off, one off, one off, one off. My concern is that if that's what we've done, it would be like hammering fence posts out on the prairie without stringing any wire in between. That financial institutions look at those fence posts and just say, tell you what, I won't run head on into one. I will make my teaser rate a month shorter or a month longer, or I'll find another way to do it, right? And the consequence would be within the space of a year, because financial products are easy to mutate, that all the changes we hammered into place would have very little effect, because there'd be you just go to the 2.0 version of the way to trick people. My response was to say that's not how we should do this. We need big systemic change. And the way we get there, we need big structural change. The way we get there is we build an agency that is modeled on the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The law wasn't, when that agency was built, you can't sell a toaster that has a 1 in 5 chance of burning down your house. It was to build an agency that says when different products come online, when we learn where the dangers are, we put regulations in place to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. And in fact, that's exactly what had happened on toasters and baby cribs and collapsing car seats and certain braking systems on cars, right? That's what the Consumer Product Safety Commission did. I said, let's do the same thing on financial products, because that gives you structural change. It's not just about the mortgages that are issued today. It's about what some bank figures out
What are some
tomorrow.
things the consumer CFPB, is that right? I mean, I remember the Wells Fargo. What are some of the things they did that were regulatory, that they actually
Mortgages.
put in place? Okay.
Mortgages. Yeah, mortgages were a huge one. They came in and put a bunch of rules in place, and today, by and large, the problem of the teaser rate mortgage, the mortgage that's going to cost people their homes, have pretty much gone away.
Do you feel like that agency has been dismantled under Trump?
Not at all.
Not at all.
So now, do understand, that agency is not doing all it should be doing and could be doing, but that says the agency has been paused by having a director, Mick Mulvaney, an acting director first, who made it clear he hated the agency, he hated the mission, he thought the agency should be working for the big banks. In fact, he wanted to put that right into their mission statement, and tried to do everything he could to redirect the agency. But the basic pieces are solid in that agency. It's already forced big banks to return more than $12 billion directly to people they cheated. It's put a lot of regulations in place. Now, it's not doing what it should be doing. They rolled back their work after Mulvaney and then the current person came in, Kraninger. They rolled back their work on arbitration clauses that are another way to trap people. And if you want to go into the weeds, I'm ready on arbitration clauses. And that one really hurts. On the other hand, that's about the agency not getting a thing done they should. It's not about dismantling the agency itself. The tools are there. We get a director back in place who actually believes in protecting consumers. That agency is ready to go. And I should add one more thing. In the meantime, that agency handles disputes. It has a complaint. If you've never used it, you should go check it out. Oh, then you know.
You can still see the database. I mean, yeah. I mean,
And so far, they've kept the database public. And think about it this way. Think about where markets work, and you get good competition. I buy this jacket. I go, I look at it in the shop, I try it on, right? I see what the fabric is, I can see what the price is. I make a good decision. There's a jacket hanging next to it, there's another jacket, there are jackets over in the next store. it's a consumer market that works pretty well. Your bank cheats you out of $15 or $150 or $1,500. You may get madder than hops, but there are two things about it. One, it is really hard for you to get a remedy. Very few people can afford to get a lawyer and sue them over any of those sums of money, right? And the second part is it's hard to get the market to work. I got cheated, maybe you got cheated by the same bank in the same way, and maybe you did too, but we have no way to find each other and to say, as consumers, dang, low quality product, I'm not going there. So what that complaint hotline does that is so amazing is it begins to introduce a market that functions. So people like you, journalists, researchers, just concerned citizens, people who make recommendations, consumer advocates, can actually run the numbers and see, how does Bank of America compare on complaints about its credit cards to...
The complaints, not to get in the weeds, but the complaints from the banks where these are, these complaints are all put online and there's no vetting and so, but that is all still public.
Well, I'm sorry.
Is that database all
Are the
still-
complaints about
Is that
junky...
all still public though?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
that's
we should-
still, and you should
should
take a
let-
look at this. It's
Yeah.
fun, but think about it. The complaints over what kind of sweater you got. Nobody vets that stuff either, but the markets work. And this is an opportunity to help the markets work. And one of the things you can tell online is not just how many complaints there were. This is what makes it so interesting. How fast were the complaints resolved? And were they resolved to the satisfaction of the customer? And here's what I have read from time to time. And you just see little reports occasionally in the media about this. And that is corporate executives, CEOs who say, I don't want to be on the list that says our bank was the slowest or our bank had the most complaints. So let's figure out why we're getting this from the CFPB, why that's what the public database shows, and let's fix this. When I come back in 3 months, I want to see that we resolved customer satisfaction the fastest and everybody was happy. And by the way, when I do town halls, I have people come up to me and say, I'm supporting you. I'm going to caucus for you. And I'll tell you why. And somebody say this just a couple of days ago. I have, what did the person say? I have 150 good reasons to do this. That's the check for $150 that I got back from Wells Fargo because those jerks had, and the person briefly described what had happened and said, and I filed a complaint with CFPB, and Wells said, done, right? And that's the thing. After the person has already complained, after they've kind of tried everything else before they go to the CFPB actually puts some power back in the hands of consumers that we can make government work for the people. We just have to have the vision and determination to make that happen.
You talk about individual debt, family debt. Do you worry about the national debt?
Yeah, I do. I also worry about corporate debt. I'm a debt worrier.
Right. So,
Yeah, debt worries me.
So, back when there was a Democrat in the White House, the Republicans very often came in here running for election, screamed holy terror about the national debt and how much President Obama had running it up. We're not hearing that now.
No.
And there's a different party in control, and the national debt is at record levels. So talk about, in your administration, how you're going to approach that issue.
Actually, can we just add one more to your point? Because your
Sure.
point's exactly right. It was the argument I got into with the Republicans when they decided they were going to do a tax cut, that we already had a ballooning national debt. And there were a lot of economists, and not just Democratic economists, not just liberal economists, a lot of economists saying, whoa, if you do a tax cut, particularly one that's aimed at the top, that is at the richest people and the biggest corporations, you're not going to get the kind of stimulative effect you're arguing. You know, you cut taxes for people who already are billionaires. They do not buy more pairs of jeans or go out to dinner and eat more meals. They're already way past that on consumption. So a lot of folks who were saying, you're just going to blow another hole in the national debt. And I had that conversation loaded with data reports with multiple of my Republican colleagues, one-on-one, out of the range of the cameras. The point was not to score political points, but to say, I've talked to you before, and you've said to me, I think with great sincerity, that you're concerned about a national debt that just keeps getting bigger, and yet you're going to take a vote in the space of a few weeks that the economists are saying is going to blow it wide open. And they nodded, said, I'll look at the data, and then lined up every single one of them and voted yes. Let's just go ahead and blow a hole in the debt. And never talked about it again. And of course, as you know, the numbers have turned out to be worse than projected. That is, we got less economic growth and higher cost than that tax cut was originally projected. So here's how I see this. That put this country deeper in a financial hole, and that makes it even harder to get universal child care, to cancel student loan debt for 43 million Americans. Makes it even harder to make the investments that we should be making in housing, in infrastructure, the investments we need to make in climate. We need to harden our infrastructure on climate. We need to make investments in green manufacturing. I've got a whole plan around this. So my response was to say, we can't simply say, debt, therefore we can't do anything. My response has been to say, when I'm out there arguing for universal child care or for housing, I'm going to show first how to pay for it. When I'm arguing for a Green New Deal, I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to pay for this. And we can make a decision as a country. It's, for me, about more progressive taxation, asking those at the top to pitch in a fair share. They pitch in a fair share, we can make those investments without increasing our national debt. And now here comes the best part. You make those investments in child care, that's the one we've been talking about, but in healthcare, in canceling student loan debt, think about the impact on the economy. Just think for a minute. All those people who are paying $558 a month on student loans and suddenly have $558 to spend on new car, eating out, down payment on a house, moving out of mom's basement, that's straight into our economy. It's mainlining that money into our economy. In fact, let me give you the one that just has an incredible impact, and that is to think about Medicare for all. So projection is over the next 10 years that Americans are going to reach in their pockets and spend about $11 trillion on premiums, co-pays, deductibles, and uncovered expenses. I'm talking about people with health insurance, right? That's how much Americans are projected to spend if we do nothing. We just stay right on our path, right? So the way I look at this is we could do that. I've studied about why families go broke, and healthcare is one of the biggest squeezes on families. So families could keep paying that $11 trillion, or we could say, wait a minute, healthcare is a basic human right. People should get access to the healthcare they need. They should be making medical decisions with their doctors and their nurse practitioners and their mental health professionals and their physical therapists without an insurance company standing in between to say, sorry, that doctor is out of network. Sorry, that prescription is not covered. Sorry, we decided you don't need to see a specialist, even if your doctor thinks you should. Taking the insurance companies out of that and saying, we're going to let people make those healthcare decisions with their medical professionals. And we're going to take that $11 trillion and we're going to ask the folks at the top just to contribute a little more. And I figured out how to pay for it without raising taxes 1 penny on middle-class families. It's basically to say we're going to ask the top 1% to pay a little more. We're going to ask the big corporations to pay a little more. And my personal favorite, we're going to squeeze the tax cheats a little harder. We have a much higher cheat rate than many other nations around the world. We're going to squeeze them a little harder, the folks at the top. So we do those 3 things, and that's $11 trillion that families don't have to spend. That is like an $11 trillion tax cut, only instead of blowing a hole in the national debt, or increasing the national debt, it has exactly the reverse effect. You put that money into the pockets of middle-class families, working families, and that's money that goes right back into the economy, just like the student loan debt, just like every other part of it. And what does that produce? It produces more economic activity and more revenue. And you start to bring down the national debt because the country is financially healthier. We need a country where the financial health of the families and the financial health of the country are moving together in the right direction, rather than a country where the folks who are doing better and better and better year after year after year are the folks who are already doing great. We need a country that invests in that opportunity and that grows this economy, not from a sugar high of giving tax breaks to those at the top, not from encouraging corporations to go out and buy up their own stock to pump up their stock prices, but a country that's about truly investing in our people, in our future, in jobs here in America. That's the big difference.
Part of your health plan, though, $20 trillion. You have laid out how you would pay for it, but then of course that gives people a way to say, oh, but this won't work and this won't work.
Sure.
That's a big risk for the economy because healthcare is such a big chunk of our economy. A lot of people look at, say, just one piece, provider reimbursements, and some of the savings are predicated on a lot more control there than has been exercised in the past. When Congress continually refuses to, wrench down provider reimbursements, how do you think you'll magically be able to accomplish it?
So, actually, let me just start with $20 trillion, since you said you'd like to be in the weeds on this. Understand the first part of that is just ask employers to keep doing what they're doing. There's no shift in that, and that takes care of $9 trillion of it, just right off the top. It says, because we already put that into law in 2010, every employer has more than 50 employees is legally obligated to provide health care coverage. And all I'm saying is instead of writing that check to ABC private for-profit insurance company, you write that check to Medicare. And now we're down to the $11 trillion that's the out-of-pocket. So if I can, let me do this first at 10,000 feet. And that is when I was trying to figure out how to put the numbers together. A lot of it is about the policy decisions we make as a country, including the policy decisions in healthcare. But I didn't just say, okay, this is how I think the numbers are going to work out. President Obama's head of Medicare looked at this, worked through it, and said, yep, your numbers are right. This is what's going to cost, and this is what we could do. We just have to decide we want to do it. President Obama's chief labor economist, who's the one who does all the tax revenues and where the tax revenues are going to come from, said, yeah, we can pull this money in. We gave it to independent economists who looked at it, and including economists who were not fans of Medicare for All, and said, yeah, we could do it. The numbers are right. I agree. The math is there and the policy is there. We can make this work. So the particular pitch on reimbursement is to say, by and large, I kind of think of it in three parts. You've got the Medicare reimbursement that you're currently getting, right? We keep inflating for the cost of healthcare generally. For hospitals, you get Medicare reimbursement plus 10%, because we realize there are a lot of other things going on at hospitals. And for rural hospitals, you get Medicare reimbursement plus 10%, plus more if you need it to stay open, because it is crucial to keep rural hospitals open so that access to healthcare is available, not just in cities, but all across this country. So that's built into part one, but here's the other half of it. What we offer in return is that for every healthcare provider, for every hospital, including every rural hospital, there's no more uncompensated care. If somebody came in the door with chest pains, you know you're going to get compensated. So you don't have to eat any of the we can't collect. You don't have to run a collections department. You don't have to squeeze families. You don't have to sue families. I hope you've seen the latest that's been coming out about the lawsuits against people who have health insurance by hospitals. And I don't blame the hospitals. They're saying the insurance company failed to cover $2,000, $20,000, $200,000. We can't afford to eat that. So they're squeezing working families. You say, wait a minute, I thought I had insurance to cover this. All of that goes away on the cost side of the ledger for the hospital. Plus, just imagine for a moment how much the hospitals are spending on insurance. Every insurance company has a different form, right? Why do they all have different forms? And why are the forms so complicated? Well, and who did you talk with, and who got prior approval before you could see the guy for the funny thing on your, eye, and on and on and on through this. And the answer is because all of those complications give insurance companies a chance to say no. And that's how they make their profits. Pull in as much as you can in premiums and say no as often as you can. And as long as they can keep that in a good balance, that's how they make $27 billion in profits in a single year, right? And they keep doing that. One of the things we never talk about, it's not just the $27 billion in profits that went to the insurance companies, it's also how much cost is borne by the hospitals and by the doctors and by the physical therapists. I don't know about you, but I go see my doctor. I see 2 doctors in there working, and I see a half dozen people who are talking to the lady in front of me. I'm sorry, Miss So-and-so, your insurance has changed, and Dr. So-and-so is no longer in network for you. So, or the doctor has recommended you do X, but the insurance, I hear them on the phone arguing with the insurance companies. That's driving costs through the roof. So part of the proposal is you get what you get under Medicare now. You account for inflation. You boost it up for hospitals. You boost it up more for rural hospitals. And then you take away a big part of their cost and say what your cost should be about is health care. It should be about the surgeries people need, the tests people need, the babies that need to have their coughs and fevers checked out. That should be the cost in the healthcare system, not billions and billions of dollars spent arguing with insurance companies.
We are really right about time. I know
Oh.
some people wanted to address some other questions. we could do it kind of as a lightning round if there's some
Is
topics.
there
you
anything
definitely
Trump
wanna
has
hit.
done, you agree with or you would commend him on?
You bet. He signed into law my hearing aid bill.
Okay.
So here's one. I love this story. More than 40 million Americans have hearing loss in this country, and yet fewer than 1 in 6 actually get help. Hearing aids, and the principal reason is cost. And this dates back a few years. I was talking actually to a scientist, and we started talking about why a hearing aid costs so much more than your phone. Right? Hearing aids are now thousands and thousands of dollars. Why do they cost more than your phone? Because they're actually not fancier. Right? They don't have more going on than your phone. And the answer, it turns out, I started digging through this, is there are only a tiny number of hearing aid companies, and they have managed to tangle up state laws all across this country to basically keep out the competition. So I thought about this and thought, this is a place where the federal laws could override state laws and make it possible to sell hearing aids over the counter. The way,
So that's what the bill
for
is.
years. So
Did you
it
work
says.
with Grassley on that?
Yes, I
Okay,
did.
that's what I was
And I
thinking.
was going to say, so I got this thing mapped out. I talked to the scientists. I said, is there, and the doctors, we really vetted this. Could people be hurt if they bought hearing aids over the counter and so on? The answer is no. You need a couple of warnings in them, but you can make this work. And the cost, the estimate is, goes from thousands of dollars down to hundreds because it's just not that expensive. So I wrote the bill, got the bill together, and then called a Republican and explained what I had in mind, and the person said yes. And then I called another Republican and another Republican and another Republican, all under the radar screen, until I had a lot of folks on this bill. At one point, the NRA came out in opposition for reasons I do not understand. But at the end of the day, we got it passed through both houses of Congress, and Donald Trump signed it into law. And hearing aids will be available over the counter within the next couple of years. I mean, it takes a while. They got to write their regulations and get
Was
them
it you
out.
and Grassley? I think I've seen press releases
Yeah,
from his office.
we were the two original co-sponsors on this.
Anything else with Grassley and Ernst? You've worked with them on anything?
Oh, we have, and I'm sorry, I'm going to block on it, but we have worked. You know, I worked with Senator Grassley back before I got in politics. Back during the crash, you may remember I'd been asked to come to Washington to head up the Congressional Oversight Panel. It was the first thing I'd done in Washington, and it was about trying to bring some accountability to the $700 billion bailout. And Senator Grassley was holding hearings. He'd have me come in and testify publicly about what was going on, and really backed me up when I couldn't get information from the Treasury Department or the Fed. Senator Grassley was there. He was strong on whistleblowers and the importance of making sure that people who had information would be able to come forward and not face retribution. And that was when I first got to know him and first worked with him. Like I said, it was long, that would have been 2009.
What would be your process for selecting nominees for the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court?
People who believe in the rule of law.
Period.
Well, I mean, I think that's fundamentally what it's about. Actually, can I give you a second one, though? It's rule of law. And I want to see people who have a wide range of experiences. I think it's a mistake if we're only going to have people on the bench who've either been corporate lawyers or federal prosecutors. And part of the reason for that is they've just seen a slice of law where resources are effectively infinite, and they've only dealt with a handful of kinds of cases. I think it's really important that we have people as judges who had small law firms and who had people who came in with problems that were $5,000 problems or $10,000 problems, but it meant a lot to the person. I think it's important to have people who worked in legal aid and saw the criminal justice system, what it looked like from the side of people for whom justice is, you get a few minutes with a legal aid lawyer who is under enormous pressure just to plead it out and keep these cases moving through the system. That's not justice. I think it's important to have people who've worked in law and seen how it works great for rich people, but isn't working for everyone else. You know, the 4 words above the Supreme Court are equal justice under law, and yet it's pretty widely stated now, better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent. We need judges who are sensitive to that, who understand that, not because they read it, but because they actually saw it unfold.
I'll take last question.
Sure.
Just off something you said yesterday.
Sure.
You said Michael Bloomberg is making a bet about democracy
Yes.
in 2020. He doesn't need people, he only needs bags and bags of money.
Yeah.
You've certainly talked about public financing.
Yep.
And needing to overturn Citizens United, which of course require a constitutional amendment. That takes time. Is there something that the Democratic Party should do in the meantime to try to ensure that a candidate can't, in essence, buy an election?
Sure. It's up to the good folks of Iowa right now. No, that's what this primary is about. Democrats across the nation, starting right here in Iowa, are going to pick a candidate. And Democrats are going to decide, what does it take to get the Democratic nomination? Does it take either being a billionaire or sucking up to billionaires? Does it take, no, it's how we finance our campaigns. This is really in the hands of the people right now. Democratic candidates who sell access to their time are following through on an America that works better and better for those at the top. Because understand this, if the only way you can be a successful candidate for the Democratic Party is either to be a billionaire or to suck up to the billionaires, we're going to have an America that's just going to keep working better and better for the billionaires. Or are we going to decide as a party in the caucuses, in the primaries, that it really is about building a grassroots movement? And I say about the importance of grassroots movement, for me, that's really about democracy. It's about having not just where your money comes from, that you're not beholden to the already rich and powerful, you're not beholden to the lobbyists and the corporate executives. You haven't sold access to your time to them, but it's really about volunteers. It's about people who care enough to get engaged and to say, my voice will be heard in this democracy. Because that is what gives us a chance to move a 2-cent wealth tax up on the agenda. That's what gives us a chance to cancel student loan debt for 43 million Americans. That's what gives us a chance to do universal child care for every one of our babies. I think of 2020 as a moment when democracy itself hangs in the balance. What kind of a country will be going forward? And the question is far less about left-right politics and far more about who owns a bigger share of our democracy. A handful of the very rich and very well connected, or tens of millions of people across this country who say, I'm in this fight because it's my fight, it touches my family, and I want to build an America that works, not just for those guys, but an America that works for us.
Thank you. That's a good
Thank
place
you.
to wrap up.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Thank you for being here, Senator, and come back to DesMoinesRegister.com for all the news about the Iowa caucuses. Thank you.